I went for a morning walk along the riverbank because my doctor told me the fresh air would do my heart good. I never expected that walk to end with me kneeling on cold, wet gravel under a highway overpass, holding my grandson's trembling hand while a 3-month-old baby cried in a cardboard-lined tent. A grandson who had spent 2 years believing I was buried in the ground. He looked up at me with those wide, dark eyes I remembered from when he was 7 years old and had fallen off his bicycle. And the first word he said was not "Grandma" or "I can't believe it." The first word he said in a broken, cracked voice that had clearly not spoken to anyone who loved him in a very long time was, "How?" And in that single syllable, I understood that someone had taken enormous care to make sure he never went looking for me. My name is Dorothy, and I am 68 years old, and for most of those 68 years, I believe that family was the one thing you could always return to. No matter how far you had strayed, no matter how many years had passed, or how many words had been said in anger. I grew up in a small house in northern Ohio, with parents who disagreed loudly and loved loudly, and made sure that every argument ended at the dinner table, with everyone still seated and still eating. My father used to say that the door of this house opens both ways. You can walk out angry, but it will always let you back in. I carried that belief the way other women carry a lucky charm or a prayer. Close to my chest, taken out in hard moments, never seriously questioned. I had one son. His name is Gerald, and I loved him in the fierce, consuming way that mothers love their firstborns. A love that is less like sunlight and more like the pull of the tide, constant and not entirely comfortable. Gerald was a handsome boy, clever in school, charming in company, and possessed of a quality I chose for many years to call confidence, and which I now understand was something else entirely. He married a woman named Patricia when he was 26. Patricia was thin-lipped and precise, the kind of woman who kept her refrigerator organized by category and her feelings organized the same way. Everything in its proper container, nothing spilling over. I told myself I liked her. I told myself that her coldness was simply shyness, that her clipped answers to my questions were efficiency rather than dismissal, that when she rearranged my kitchen when I wasn't looking, she was simply being helpful. I was a woman who had spent 6 decades telling herself charitable stories about the people she loved, and I was very, very good at it. They had a son, my grandson, and they named him Daniel. From the moment I first held him, 3 hours old, red-faced, furious with the world for being so bright and so cold. He was mine in some essential, wordless way. He had Gerald's dark eyes and my mother's wide forehead and a temperament that was entirely his own, stubborn, tender, quick to laugh, slow to forgive. He used to come to my house every Friday after school, drop his backpack by the door with a crash that shook the walls, and stand in my kitchen eating crackers with peanut butter while telling me everything that had happened that week in the particular breathless way that children have when they are certain someone is genuinely listening. I was always listening. I kept a box in my closet with every drawing he ever made me. Every card, every folded piece of notebook paper with "I love you, Grandma" written in his changing handwriting over the years. First the big, unsteady letters of a child, then the careful printed letters of a boy trying to impress, then the loose, careless scrawl of a teenager who was too cool to print neatly, but still brought me cards. Gerald and Patricia moved to a larger house when Daniel was 12, a house 40 minutes away, which should have been nothing, but which Patricia seemed to regard as a natural boundary. The Friday visits became irregular. My calls to Gerald went longer between responses. I told myself this was normal, that families stretch and shift as children grow, that I was being sensitive, that I should not expect to remain at the center of my son's life forever. I bought myself a small garden. I joined a book club. I learned at 63 to be content in my own company in a way I had not needed to learn before. I told Francis, my neighbor, that I was lucky, a word that sat in my mouth like a pebble, smooth and cool and entirely without flavor. The last time I saw Daniel, he was 19. He had come alone without his parents knowing, driving a second-hand car with a cracked windshield and the radio stuck on a country station he claimed to hate, but sang along with anyway. He sat at my kitchen table and drank 3 cups of coffee and told me that he had a girlfriend, that her name was Marisol, that she was wonderful and his parents did not approve of her, and he did not particularly care. He told me that things at home were difficult. He told me that his father and he had argued, badly, over something he was not ready to talk about yet, and that his mother had sided with his father, and that the house felt like a place where people lived together but did not speak. He looked tired in the way that young people look tired when they are carrying something too heavy for the size of their arms. I made him eggs. I told him that the door of my house opened both ways, that he could always come back, that whatever it was, it would not change anything between us. He hugged me at the door for a long time before he left, longer than he usually did, and I stood on the porch watching his car until it turned the corner and disappeared, and I thought, he'll be fine. He's 19. This is what 19 feels like. I did not hear from him again. At first, the silence was simply silence. Gerald told me, when I called, that Daniel was going through things and needed space. Patricia told me, in the even, measured tone she used for all unpleasant communications, that Daniel had made some choices they did not support and that it was best, for now, if I did not contact him directly. I accepted this. God help me, I accepted it, because I had spent so many years accepting Patricia's precision and Gerald's authority over his own household that I did not recognize the sound of a door being quietly and deliberately locked. 6 months passed, then a year. I left messages on a number that was eventually disconnected. I wrote letters to Gerald's address, physical letters, sealed and stamped, because I thought a physical letter could not simply be deleted, and received no replies. Then, 14 months after my last conversation with Daniel, Gerald called me on a Tuesday evening in October. It was raining, I remember, one of those flat Ohio rains that turns the world gray and smells of wet leaves and cold concrete. I was sitting in my living room with a cup of tea and a book I had been trying to finish for 3 weeks. Gerald's voice on the phone was strange, careful in a way that told me he had rehearsed what he was about to say. He told me that Daniel and Marisol had been in an accident. He told me that it had been serious. He paused, in the way that people pause before the sentence that is going to change something permanently. And then he told me that Daniel had not survived. I will not describe those months in detail. Some griefs do not belong fully in a story. I will say only that I believed him because he was my son and Daniel was his son, and I could not conceive of a reason to fabricate something so monstrous, and that belief settled over me like concrete, slow and permanent and final. I arranged a small memorial. I planted a rosebush in my garden with a small stone marker. I learned to live around the absence the way you learn to live around a missing tooth. Aware of it always, probing at it reflexively, never fully accustomed to it no matter how many mornings you wake up and make yourself accept it all over again. It was Frances, my neighbor, who made me start walking again that spring. She appeared at my door one March morning with her walking shoes on and an expression that left no room for negotiation. And she said, "Dorothy, you are going to walk with me to the river and back, and then you are going to eat breakfast, and then you are going to feel marginally better. And if you don't, we will try again tomorrow." She was not wrong about the marginally better. We began walking every morning along the riverbank path, a flat paved trail that wound along the water for 3 miles before it passed under the highway overpass and looped back through the park. I liked the river in the early morning. The smell of it, cold and clean and slightly mineral, the sound of it moving under the quiet, the way the light came off the water in long, flat strips in the spring. I had been walking that path for nearly 2 months when I saw the tent. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way. Pale sky, mild air, the river running a little high from recent rain. The tent was set back under the overpass, partly hidden behind one of the concrete support pillars, gray-green canvas that blended almost perfectly with the shadow. I would not have noticed it at all if a small sound had not cut through the ambient noise of the water and the distant highway. A thin, insistent sound, the sound of a very young baby crying. Frances had walked ahead of me, and I had stopped without knowing why. The way you sometimes stop when your body understands something half a second before your mind does. The crying continued, high and rhythmic, full of the uncomplicated outrage of an infant who does not yet know that the world does not always respond immediately. And then the tent flap moved, and a hand came out, young and bare in the cool morning air, and a young man ducked through the opening, cradling a bundled infant against his chest with the practiced, exhausted competence of someone who has been doing this alone for a very long time. He was standing with his back to me, swaying slightly the way parents sway, rocking the baby in small, unconscious circles. And I stood on the path 30 feet away watching him, and something in the line of his back, the particular set of his shoulders, the way he tilted his head down toward the child, pulled at something inside me that I did not have a name for. Not recognition, exactly. Not yet. Something more primitive than recognition. Something that came from below the level of thought, from the place where the body keeps its oldest and most stubborn memories. He turned. The air left my lungs completely. The path seemed to tilt. I was aware, absurdly, of the sound of my own pulse, a loud, insistent thudding in my ears that blotted out the river and the highway and everything else, that turned the whole world briefly into a small, silent room containing only the two of us and the baby, and the impossible fact of this moment. Daniel was standing 15 feet away from me, my grandson whom I had mourned for a year, whom I had planted roses for, whom I had watched disappear around a corner in a second-hand car with a cracked windshield. Daniel was standing under a highway overpass holding his infant child, and he was alive, and he was thin and dirty and hollow-eyed and staring at me with an expression I had never seen on a human face before, and hope never to see again. The expression of a person watching the laws of reality rearrange themselves without permission. "Grandma?" His voice cracked on the second syllable. The baby continued to cry unhelpfully, punctuating the impossible moment with its ordinary need. My legs were not working the way they usually worked. I moved toward him anyway because there was no other direction, and when I reached him, I put my hand on his face, his cold, unshaved face, the cheekbone too prominent, the skin chapped from weather. And I said his name, and he flinched as though I had burned him, and then he made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, something low and broken that seemed to come from very far down, and he sat down abruptly on the cold gravel with the baby still against his chest, and I sat down next to him on the ground, and we stayed like that for a long time, while the baby gradually quieted and the river moved past us, and the highway hummed steadily overhead, and I tried to understand what had happened to my world. "They told me you died," he said finally. His voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone reporting facts they have long since exhausted their feelings for. "Dad called me, said you had a heart attack in November, said the funeral was private, that you'd wanted it that way." He paused. He looked at me sideways as though he still half expected me to dissolve or to reveal himself as a cruel hallucination produced by cold nights and poor nutrition. That was almost 2 years ago. I stayed very still. The gravel was cold through my trousers. The baby, a girl I would learn later, 3.5 months old, named Rosa, had fallen asleep against Daniel's chest, one small fist curled under her chin with the absolute trustfulness of infants. Somewhere above us, a truck crossed the overpass and the whole concrete structure shuddered faintly, a deep vibration I felt more than heard. I thought about Gerald's voice on the phone that October evening. I thought about how careful it had been, how rehearsed, how it had carried within it the particular smoothness of a lie that has been told so many times it has acquired the texture of truth. I thought about the rose bush in my garden with its small stone marker. I thought about all of it, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but the precursor to anger, the cold and gathering stillness that comes just before everything changes. "Tell me everything," I said. Daniel talked for a long time, there on the gravel under the bridge, while the morning light shifted and Rosa slept on and the river kept its indifferent course. He talked in the halting, uncertain way of someone who has not had a real conversation in months, stopping to check my face, restarting sentences, circling back to things he had already said as though to verify they were still true. I let him talk. I did not interrupt. I had waited 2 years for this, though I had not known I was waiting. When Marisol discovered she was pregnant, Daniel had gone to Gerald and Patricia, not for permission, but for support, because he was 20 and frightened and still believed that parents existed partly for moments like this. What he received instead was an ultimatum, delivered in Patricia's measured clinical voice across their kitchen island. He could end the pregnancy, and they would continue their financial help. Or he could keep the child, and he was on his own. Gerald had stood slightly behind Patricia during this entire conversation and said nothing of substance. He had looked, Daniel told me, at a point approximately 6 inches above Daniel's left shoulder, the place people look when they cannot meet your eyes but are too cowardly to look away entirely. Daniel had chosen Marisol and Rosa. Of course he had. He lost the warehouse job when Marisol needed him. Rosa was born healthy, but the money was gone, the rented room was gone, and the jobs Daniel found did not last long enough. There had been a friend's couch, a shelter, a motel room that ate through the last of their savings. The tent had been, he said quietly, actually better in some ways. At least no one was charging $120 a night for the privilege. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked. He looked at me with those dark, exhausted eyes. "Dad called me in November," he said, 2 months after you told me to come back any time. He said you'd been at home alone and your neighbor had found you. He said it was fast. He described the service. He said you'd been cremated, that you'd wanted it that way. He said you'd updated your will before you died and left everything to a charity. He adjusted the blanket around Rosa. "I didn't see the point of calling a lawyer," You were gone. The cold that moved through me then was not the cold of the morning air. It started in my chest and spread outward with a surgical precision, the kind that clarifies rather than numbs. My will. Gerald had told Daniel I had updated my will. I had not updated my will in 6 years. My house, my savings, the portfolio my late husband had left me, all of it still designated to Gerald, with a secondary provision for Daniel. And Gerald had closed that door by telling his son that the door no longer existed. We drove to my house with Rosa strapped into the spare car seat Frances kept for her grandchildren, an irony so sharp I could barely look at it. Daniel sat in the passenger seat with his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing back at Rosa with the vigilant anxiety of a very young father. I watched the back of his head, and I thought about Gerald's voice on the phone. Careful, rehearsed. And I thought, you will answer for this. I fed Daniel at my kitchen table. He ate without embarrassment, which I was glad of. Rosa sat in my lap and grasped my finger with the full, startling strength of a 3-month-old who does not yet understand how small she is. Then I called my lawyer. Martin Cho had handled my affairs for 15 years and was not a man who expressed surprise easily. But the pause after I finished speaking contained, I think, a great deal of it. He asked several careful questions. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the measured voice he used when choosing words with particular precision, "Dorothy, what Gerald told Daniel constitutes a serious misrepresentation. If he made that statement to interfere with Daniel's legal interests as a named beneficiary in your will, there may be grounds for action. I want you to come in tomorrow. Bring your grandson." I called Gerald that evening. I had spent the afternoon composing myself, sitting in my garden with my coffee, looking at the rose bush with its small stone marker, deciding exactly who I was going to be during this conversation. Not the mother who flinched and kept the peace. I was going to be precise. I was going to give him enough rope. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice easy and ordinary. "Mom, everything okay?" "I was wondering," I said, "if you could tell me about Daniel's memorial, where his ashes were scattered. I'd like to visit." A silence. Short, but not short enough. "What about it?" "The address. I should have gone sooner." "I'd have to look it up," he said carefully. "I'll call you back." "Of course," I said. "Take your time." I set the phone down and looked at Daniel across the table. "He needs to look it up," I said quietly, "because there is no address." He did not call back that evening. He called the next morning, and his voice had changed. The easiness was gone, replaced by something tightly controlled. He said that the situation with Daniel was more complicated than he had led me to believe, that he and Patricia had made decisions in a difficult time that had perhaps not been, he reached for the word, ideal. "Gerald," I said, "I found Daniel under a bridge 3 days ago. He has a 3-month-old daughter, and he has been living in a tent. And he believed I was dead because you told him I was dead." The silence this time was the silence of a person who has been running for a long time and has just looked down and found that the ground has run out. Martin confirmed the rest when we met in his office, Daniel and I on one side of the heavy oak table, coffee growing cold at my elbow. 14 months ago, 1 month before Gerald had delivered the news of my fictitious death to his son, Gerald had approached an elder law attorney asking about updating his mother's will via power of attorney. He had claimed I was experiencing cognitive decline. The attorney had declined without meeting me directly. Gerald had not followed up because the attempt had failed and he had needed a different approach. He had needed me to simply disappear from Daniel's calculations entirely. Daniel pressed his face into his hands when Martin finished speaking. Then he raised his head and looked at me with his father's dark eyes and said, very quietly, "He was going to take your house. He was going to try," I said. The confrontation came on a Wednesday afternoon. I brought Martin and Francis. Patricia opened the door, and her face, for one unguarded moment, showed exactly what it was: fear, pure and clarifying. Then the composure came back down like a curtain, and she said in her measured voice, "Dorothy, this isn't a good time." "It never will be," I said, and I walked past her. Gerald was in the kitchen. He looked smaller than I remembered. He looked like a man who had not slept in several days and had known precisely why. "Mom," he said, "I want you to know that I'm genuinely Gerald." I sat down at his kitchen island, the island across which he had delivered his ultimatum to his 20-year-old son. "My lawyer has documented your inquiry to the elder law attorney. Daniel has provided a recorded account of what you told him. I have a meeting with the county prosecutor's office Monday." I set my hands flat on the counter. "You will provide Daniel with a notarized statement confirming that you lied about my death and my will. You will sign a document acknowledging the false representations to the elder law attorney. You will transfer $12,000 to Daniel's account within 30 days, and you will not contest my will in any future form." I paused. "If you agree, Martin will recommend against criminal referral. If you don't, I'll let the process go where it goes." "That's extortion," Patricia said, her voice gone high and thin. She was genuinely surprised. She had built her understanding of me entirely on the woman who accepted things, and she had no frame of reference for this one. "No," I said. "This is a consequence. There is a difference." Gerald signed everything 11 days later in Martin's office, with the expression of a man swallowing something, doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Patricia was not present. The large, orderly house went on the market some weeks after. I did not ask for details. That chapter was finished, and I did not need to read the final pages. 8 months later, I sat on my porch in the early morning with my coffee and the blue quiet of a day not yet fully committed to being day. The rosebush had bloomed that summer with an extravagance that surprised even Francis. Deep red roses on every branch, more than I could count. I had removed the small stone marker. There was no need for it anymore. Inside, I could hear Rosa beginning her morning sounds, the small conversational murmurings of a child practicing language, testing the acoustics of the world one syllable at a time. I could hear Daniel's voice answering her, low and unhurried, the voice of a young man who has learned what it means to have something worth coming home to. I had lost something in all of this. I want to be honest about that. I had lost the son I thought I had, or rather, the story I had told myself about him for 40 years, which amounts to the same thing. Those losses are real, and they stay with you, folded into the new shape of things like scar tissue. But scar tissue is strong. That is the thing no one tells you about it. It holds. Rosa said something new inside, a bright, insistent syllable, proud with discovery. And Daniel laughed, and I wrapped both hands around my cup and watched the sun come up over my garden, and I thought, the door is still open. It always was. I just finally understood who it was meant for.